because you've got this dynamic. Another problem with these models is they're really big. They're really complex models. There's not one person that knows the whole of any one model. There's massive teams involved, and they can take up to a month to run. So they get out of date rather quickly. And that's problematic. This is the PV cost projections for the most recent AR5 integrated assessment models. And that's their projections going forward to 2050. This is what actually happened in PV in China in the last 5 years. So already the cost of solar is below most of the, if not all of the projections in 2020. Even worse than that, it's below most of the projections in 2050. So you can imagine these models will not incorporate enough solar PV in their models if they're out of date so quickly. And these technologies are changing so quickly, it's not surprising that they're not able to keep up. So is there a better perspective? Well, this is the relationship we're looking at here. On the left-hand side, you've got the costs of various energy sources. You've got in brown and black and grey, you've oil, coal and gas for the last century. When you adjust for inflation, the costs haven't changed much in the last century, no more than an order of magnitude. And then literally coming down out of the heavens, that orange line, the cost of solar, which has dramatically dropped over the last 50 years to the point where it's in price parity or close to with those competing technologies, fossil fuels. You also can see the blue line there, which is wind, green, which is electrolyzers used for storage. We've got batteries in that as well. On the right-hand side, you can see the relation in terms of deployment. So the more you deploy, the more the costs come down. And you can see the deployment for solar and wind and electrolyzers going up at a rapid rate. So exponential growth in the deployment of these technologies, which leads possibly to exponential decline in costs. So what we did is looked at technological progress through this lens. One of the things that you can see about looking at many different technologies is most technologies, inflation adjusted, don't have their cost decline much through time. You can see most of the bell curve there is around zero. So most of this is from the price of the annual growth rate in price of US manufacturing goods between 1958 and 2011. So a negative number means the cost has come down. Zero means the costs haven't changed over that period. So most of the goods are around that, not coming down. But there's some goods, like electronic computers, that have come down quite dramatically in their costs through time. So that's one thing. Different technologies have different technological progress rates. Also, as you can see in this graphic here, there's a real consistency in how these technologies progress in terms of their cost declines. Up at the top, if there's any mothers and fathers in this group, you can see something you've seen happening in your life, that hospital services, college tuitions, and so forth are going up in costs fairly regularly. And you've got some technologies there that haven't changed much, like cars and furnishing. But then look at televisions, computer software, and notice how consistent those declines are through time. So once a technology becomes established, you can actually get a fairly consistent decline in, you can get a fairly consistent picture of how their costs will progress through time. So how can we take advantage of these trends? Well, there are some empirical laws that have been developed. You're probably familiar to Gordon Moore's law, which was a relationship that he found between the processing power of computer chips that were doubling every 2 years. That has obvious implications for costs. And basically it says that the costs have a relationship through time. An alternative and older law is known as Wright's law, which Paul Theodore Wright is an interesting guy. Back in World War II, was helping produce airplanes for the war effort. And what he found was the more they produced of these planes, the cheaper the cost got. They learned by doing. And that's why in his work, cumulative production is used as a proxy for experience. And he found that when you produce more, when you double the amount that you've deployed, your costs come down at a fairly consistent rate. Both of these laws work rather well for quite a wide range of technologies. As you can see there on the graphic, there's transistors, photovoltaics, hard disk drives, and ethanol processing. Each of those work fairly well using both Moore's and Wright's law. Wright's law is important because it has policy implications. The government can do something about it. Investors can do something about it. The more you deploy of these technologies, the more the cost will come down. What we did and what Doan's group did, that is, many people have been using both Moore's and Wright's law to understand technological change through time. What Doan's group did was apply a methodology to that that allows us to come up with consistent and reliable error bars associated with those projections into the future. So they validated it over 50 technologies and provided these experience curves that forecast the costs into the future given a certain deployment rate. This was published in 2016, and you can see from what happened since they published that they got things fairly right, although the costs came down a little bit faster than their median level. That was within the bounds of uncertainty that they'd predicted. So how can we make use of this, and what might it do to change their perspective of how fast and how cheaply we can decarbonize our energy system? So look at this graphic again that I showed you. If we take one of the International Energy Agency's projections from 2019 and convert it into a global energy system, you'll see here that the fossil fuel industry declines somewhat through time. The blue is electricity. Most of that is through renewables, but some through carbon capture and storage. And you see emissions coming down by about 30% in this scenario by 2040. So you get progress towards the Paris goals, but change is not really happening fast enough. Alternatively, if we put in our future projections of PV costs into the same sort of model, we get a very different picture. Things don't change much for the first 5 years, then you get that exponential growth. And that's the thing with exponential growth. Nothing happens for a long time, then wham, it hits you. This is predicated on us continuing our aggressive deployment of these technologies like solar and wind and batteries and so forth. So this is not necessarily what's going to happen, but we are only just using the same trends that have been happening for the last 20 years and projecting them forward another decade before they then dominate the energy system and we taper them off. And what you should notice here is that the fossil fuel industry in this scenario is only about less than 20% of what it was in 2020, and your emissions are reduced by 80%. So basically that'll put you on the Paris alignment, as I will show. And what does that mean for the costs? Well, to do that, we had to build an empirically grounded technological forecast modeling. We applied our statistical analysis to oil, coal, and gas, and so came up with a prediction of how they would move through time. Not surprisingly, they continue on their same trend. And then we apply that also to a number of different technologies, the key technologies being solar and wind for generating electricity, and then batteries for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, and then electrolyzers for producing hydrogen for seasonal storage and for some of those hard to abate sectors like shipping and steel and so forth. And we built a model that provides about 90% of the final energy of the global system. I won't go into that details, but all you really need to know is we've got two scenarios. One that has the system as it is with dispatchable baseload energy. In another scenario, the fast transition, that is rapidly replaced by renewables plus battery. And for your liquid fuels, that's replaced by renewables plus hydrogen, probably shipped around as ammonia, which is a very efficient way of transporting hydrogen. And so you can actually replace the entire fossil fuel energy system with this combination of renewables plus batteries plus hydrogen. And so if you do that, if you do a fast transition to these technologies, what will you get as opposed to no transition? Well, we find that we actually save trillions with this fast transition. The median total savings is around 26 trillion by 2070. What you can see there is the total cost of the energy system growing through time in 3 different scenarios. The bar on the left is the no transition, so keeping the same energy mix. We slow down the deployment of renewables, and we keep the fossil fuel system we've got, and we grow everything at 2% annually. Alternatively, we still grow everything 2% annually, but we transition rapidly with the blue one to non-fossil fuels, so solar, wind, batteries, electrolyzers. And you can see that rapid transition happening with the blue thick bars declining. So most of the energy system is decarbonized and based on renewables by 2050. And because the height of the bars are different, the gap between each of those bars every year adds up to about 26 trillion in the median case. So we're saving money by going to this system. We should actually be doing it regardless of climate change. And what does that mean for China? Well, a number of people have questioned what we've done and said, well, what does it mean in terms of regional differences? There's going to be places where the sun isn't as good or the wind isn't as good. Well, one important thing to note, this is the cost of solar installation going down through time. Each of those bubbles is an installation of solar. The bigger the bubble, the bigger the installation. And what you can see is the trend is that they're declining through time. But also that band, which is the 95th to the 5th percentile, so the majority of that data is in that band. The laggards, the ones that are at the top, the slowest, in 10 years, their costs are below the 5th percentile, the best 10 years ago. So technological progress is overcoming all of those regional differences quite quickly. And China, if you look at the spread of all the different countries, is doing particularly well in that regard. That is because solar is close to price parity in most parts of China, if not now, then it will be in the next 5 years. So renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. That's not renewables plus storage. So at some point, you're going to have to compare solar and batteries to fossil fuels. But what you've got here is a disruptive technology. So very interesting times at the moment. And what you can also see there in the graph on the left is the module costs aren't that much different between the different countries. Some of the major differences are actually in those soft costs, in financing and in installation of these technologies. And that's learning by doing. Those countries on the right-hand side aren't necessarily the countries that have the best solar or wind. They're the countries that have learned by doing, by installing the most solar and wind.
If I can unmute this, you can hear
But
him.
that's not to say that China is not going to have difficulty in this transition. I think many countries will. China has a very young and large coal industry. And some of the projections that have been done at the national level, this one is from He et al. 2020, shows that there's a fairly dramatic decline in jobs in the coal industry that could happen during this transition. A lot of that is happening already through automation, but there is still the impact that this is going to have on the coal industry in terms of jobs. The analysis that some of my colleagues at Oxford have done have shown that there is actually more jobs in renewables. Coal wages are, and oil and gas wages are potentially higher on average, but the wages for renewables are at least above average. But the most concerning thing really is that there's going to be significant regional and skill shortages. So stranded locations rather than stranded assets necessarily. And finally, China has a heck of a lot to gain from this situation. They are the country that has gained the most from the green growth that has been happening over the last 5 to 10 years. And most of those gains have been through the exports of renewable energy products. So China really is in the pole position to gain the most from this greening of the energy system. And I can only but encourage them to continue in that trend because I think they'll have some pleasant surprises in terms of costs. So my conclusions, to compare what I've done to what you're getting from the IPCC, which makes you believe that getting to 2 degrees will require our economic growth to suffer or energy usage to be reduced, or we need enormous amounts of carbon capture and storage, heroic amounts, and electricity prices are going to be higher. Alternatively, this fast transition here doesn't require any economic growth reductions. That might be a good idea, and same with energy use reductions. Actually, that's a very good idea, and it's going to make both of those scenarios cheaper. So we should be doing that, but we don't require that for our results here. We don't require carbon capture and storage either. But when we get to that point, you can see there that we're not down to zero in this scenario because there's many other sources of emissions that need to be abated. So we will very likely, extremely likely, need carbon capture and storage and quite a bit of it. And so we've got to build up that capacity. And my colleague, Myles Allen, will be presenting on an approach to ensure that we do have that capability when we need it, and we need it now. Finally, because we're not using as much carbon capture and storage, and we're relying on technologies that costs decline in, we found that electricity prices could actually be dramatically different. 1/3 of business as usual. And as you can imagine, that can do a lot for sustainable development goals. So there's an opportunity here to change the mood music that's being played to decision makers, that a continued strong growth in investment in key renewable and storage technologies, as was presented in the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda over the next decade, will put us on track to meeting the Paris emissions goals, will cost trillions less than business as usual, will need not reduce economic prosperity. Actually, it could actually increase prosperity. In history, every time that we've got access to cheap energy, we've had a boom, we've had an economic resurgence. And that's very likely to happen in a fast transition. China in particular, and my colleague Professor Lee will be talking about the challenges faced by China, are difficult and they must be addressed, but there is much to gain from this clean energy transition, including a huge growth in exports of these products. If you're interested in what I presented, please go to the energychallenge.info website for more information. Thank you. So 28, I think we should probably go straight to the next talk unless there's any burning questions in the audience here. We've got some in the, we can hear, technology costs may be reducing, but does your approach take account of the material resources extraction impacts and the embodied carbon in making, distributing and disposing of these technologies? That's an excellent question, Tony, thank you. Actually, I've been bashing the International Energy Agency a bit here, and now I'm going to talk about the good work that they're doing in actually looking at the material resource requirements of the technological trends that we're seeing. And yes, we're going from a fossil fuel-based system to a material-based system. So you will actually have growth in the materials that are going to be required. And that is one of the reasons some people put in these models, you know, these barriers to us, you know, doing this rapid transition. However, one thing these models, and as a modeler myself, I know is it's difficult. It's fairly simple to put these barriers into the models to say that they're not going to be able to do this, they're not going to be able to do that. What we're not very good at modeling is human ingenuity, our ability to overcome these problems. Elon Musk is facing a problem with nickel and cobalt in his batteries. He's talking about sidestepping that to using iron, which is quite abundant in a certain number of batteries. You can't do it in all because it's a heavier metal, but you know, there are solutions to some of these problems, and we've shown consistently, and actually that's what the experience curves show. They show the problems that we've encountered. There was a balsa wood shortage for wind at one point, and then we overcame that. And so the rate at which we are able to overcome those problems is what actually makes up the experience curve, and what makes the experience curve a good conduit for understanding how the pace of progress could go. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the second speaker, Professor Myles Allen. Myles is a professor of geosystem science, the School of Geography and the Environment and the Department of Physics. He's the director of the Oxford Net Zero program and lead author of the 1.5 degrees report.
Headphones.
An incredibly wonderful person, I'm pleased to say. So very happy to have Myles join us here on the stage. Thank you, Myles.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much, Matt. And thank you very much indeed to the China Corporate Pavilion for giving us the chance to talk to you today. I'm going to be taking, can I just sort of double check with the folks on Zoom, maybe if somebody's tracking Zoom here.
It's gone now.
Audio as well. Yep. Great, so I'm taking a rather different take to, actually it's a very complementary take, but looking at a very different part of the problem to the problem that Matt was talking about. This is a backstop policy, which Matt gave a very good sort of segue, a good link between our two talks, when he pointed out that the transition that he was describing reduced global emissions by roughly 2/3, maybe a bit more, maybe 3/4, between now and 2050, but didn't get it all the way to net zero. And of course, the fundamental thing we're addressing, which I'm very happy seems to be very widely acknowledged in this COP, is we've got to get to net zero by mid-century or not long thereafter if we're going to meet our climate goals. So this is sort of those integrated assessment models that Matt was rightly having a go at. This is what they tell you, but the overall picture, although for emissions ends up quite similar. These are the sort of ambitious integrated assessment model scenarios that meet the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. You can see that if you just sort of take an average of the technology neutral scenarios in the latest IPCC assessment, this shows you the total carbon dioxide produced in black from energy and industry, and then net emissions to the atmosphere in blue. And of course, the huge gray wedge there is the total carbon that is re-injected back underground. So this is the carbon sequestered through a combination of either capture at point sources or recapture from the atmosphere through BECCS or other direct air capture technologies in these scenarios. So the important points to stress in this is that in order to meet our climate goals, we clearly have to produce less CO2. That's the first thing we need to be doing in the short term, but we also need to store more CO2. And that's the part of the picture which isn't happening on anything like the scale it needs to happen at the moment. You could argue that both sides of that coin need attention, but driving up CO2 storage is an area of particular concern to me, because if you look at what's been happening over the past couple of decades, it's been very slow. And people jump on that to say there's something fundamentally wrong with the principle or the technologies, and say, oh, CCS will never happen because it hasn't happened yet. My response to that is I think the reason carbon capture and storage has made so little progress over the past couple of decades is actually nothing to do with the technology at all, and everything to do with the fact that we've got the policy environment wrong in terms of how we incentivize it. So we tend to think of carbon capture in this way. This is a figure from a recent Goldman report showing the sort of typical way in which people think about how to reduce emissions. And it's all about comparing the costs of different points on what they call the marginal abatement cost curve. And this shows you in the horizontal greenhouse gas emissions abatement. So how much can we reduce emissions by deploying different technologies, by doing different measures? And Matt will no doubt complain that some of the points on this curve are at the wrong height because they're using outdated estimates of PV, although I think Goldman actually used rather better estimates than more realistic estimates than some of the integrated assessment models. But the main point about this figure is that it distinguishes between measures to reduce CO2 production in red. So those would be the cost of replacing coal with PV, that Matt was talking about, or the costs of improving the energy efficiency of our energy system, and then measures to increase CO2 storage in blue. Now, remember in the previous figure, we need to do both, but what you notice is consistently up to about 75% of our, it's all good, up to about 75% of the emission reductions. So down to that point where Matt was saying you could get to with that fast transition to PV, it's cheaper to reduce production than it is to increase storage. But then after that, reducing production, the cost of reducing production goes through the roof. And so that final 25% of emissions, most of which are not directly in part of the electricity, certainly not part of the electricity generation sector, but they're the sort of hard to abate activities that we've been talking about a lot in this COP. Those are the ones where increasing storage looks to be potentially the answer to dealing with those final emissions. So that sort of crossover in the Goldman analysis, and I'm sure there's other analyses possible, comes at around 75% of emissions. That's why at that point, it becomes more cost effective to get rid of the CO2 back underground than it does to change or avoid the activity that generates the CO2 in the first place. The other challenge, of course, that engineered disposal of CO2, putting CO2 back underground faces, is that there's many cheaper options. By the way, I'm very happy to share my slides. I think Matt, we'll put them up on the side afterwards. So if people want to follow this as well, that's also possible. You'll see that this slide distinguishes so-called nature-based or sort of partly nature-based options for increasing CO2 storage in green with engineered solutions in blue. And the engineered solutions primarily involve putting the carbon dioxide back underground or turning it back into rocks in some way. And you'll notice that over on the left, there's quite a few big chunks of opportunities for nature-based CO2 storage, afforestation, agroforestry, and so forth. Now, the difficulty, so what that means is, you know, for the next decade or so, it may well be that even if we accept the need to increase CO2 storage, we'll go for the cheaper versions of CO2 storage. We'll just deploy more nature-based solutions and still won't move on to the engineered solutions that we will need in the end. There are lots of low-cost opportunities for nature-based climate solutions. I can't stress that enough, but I also need to remind you that trees take time to grow. And there was a paper published just recently, led by Cécile Girardin, where we looked at the temperature impact of the most optimistic estimates out there of the potential of nature-based climate solutions. And we found they could shave about 1/10 of a degree off global temperatures by mid-century. Now, just to remind you, 1/10 of a degree is roughly what global temperatures have gone up since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. So they can help, but they're not going to provide the whole answer to stopping fossil fuels from causing global warming. There's also, of course, the really worrying trend, the really problematic trend, which is that the carbon stores in the biosphere are increasingly vulnerable to climate change itself. If we store fossil carbon in trees, it is vulnerable as the world warms to going back into the atmosphere. So if we want to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming, we need to get to the point where we're storing back underground 1 ton of carbon dioxide for every ton produced by continued use of fossil fuels. This is just maths. It's not a policy statement. That's what it's going to take. And this is taking one of those integrated assessment models. There was even dramatic music off. I hope you could hear it online when I made that important statement. Okay, so to get to this point, in one of those IAM scenarios, you can see, you know, the reductions that happen, and we can frame this picture in a rather different way, which is, I think, the way we should be thinking about this. And this is the way, if you take nothing away from you, take this single point, we need to start thinking about in our policies, possibly even, dare I say it, in our NDCs, giving the incredibly useful information of what fraction of carbon dioxide that is still produced by burning fossil fuels is being disposed of back underground. Right now, globally, this fraction is less than 0.1%. Okay, most of that happening, by the way, in the United States, some in, some in Australia, some, so not in the places you might expect, but there is some carbon dioxide going back under the Earth's crust, but it's axiomatic that that fraction has to be 100% for us to achieve a durable net zero economy. So we need to start monitoring it. We don't even know what it is. We don't know what this fraction's doing. We don't know what it is in the collective NDCs submitted for 2030. It would be great to know, because if we look at these scenarios, it goes up. Obviously it goes up. It has to get to 100%. It has to increase if it's going to get there. In cost-effective scenarios that reach net zero by 2050, it's around 10% by 2030. I don't know what it is in the NDCs because it's not reported, but I can assure you it's not 10%. So we need to start monitoring this fraction. And just to remind you what the fraction is I'm talking about, it's the fraction of carbon dioxide produced by burning fossil fuels, with the fraction of that carbon dioxide that is put back underground or permanently disposed of. Matt was emphasizing this, but I'm just going to re-emphasize it. In conventional integrated assessment models, these reductions in emissions and increases in storage come about because of very, very high demand management measures, which are here modeled by an effective global carbon price. And if you look at the numbers there, that equivalent carbon price in this model, I've picked one out, it's the EASA message model, but you could look at any of the others, you get a very similar picture. I'm not singling out EASA for particular sort of poking here. You need a carbon price in excess of $1,000 per ton of CO2 to actually drive emissions all the way to net zero. Now, that should puzzle you, because $1,000 per ton of CO2 is more than the cost of capturing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and burying it back underground, even today, never mind in 2050. So why do the models seem to think that we need such very, very high carbon prices in order to get us all the way to net zero? Well, the answer, when we look at in detail, and Stuart Jenkins, I obviously should have emphasized at the beginning of this talk that I'm really presenting on behalf of Stuart Jenkins. This is work that he's recently published in a paper in Joule. And the reason he found that these integrated assessment models end up with these very, very high carbon prices is that the modelers assume that we don't build the plant to get rid of carbon dioxide fast enough. So there's a hard limit in the models at how fast we deploy carbon capture and storage. And that's imposed by the modelers. It's insensitive to the carbon price at these very high ambition scenarios. And that's what we want to challenge. How can we ensure that we deploy CO2 storage fast enough that we don't end up in this, what I would call a nightmare scenario of requiring carbon prices of $1,000 a ton of CO2. Just to remind you, the carbon price that brought out the Gilets jaunes onto the streets of Paris was an increase, I think, of equivalent less than well under $10 per ton of CO2. Okay, that was the increase that basically almost brought down the government of France. Now we're talking about an increase of 100 times that. Sorry, I'm not very good at mental arithmetic when I'm on screen. And somehow that's seen as a low risk transition scenario. It's not. That kind of heavy demand reduction measures is high risk. People need to acknowledge that. So what's an alternative? Well, this is what I'd like to talk to you about in the last 10 minutes of my talk. I want to introduce you to the idea of a carbon takeback obligation. So suppose, just imagine, instead of relying on a carbon price to drive down emissions and eventually drive up storage, you actually introduce a requirement on anyone introducing fossil carbon into the world economy or into a subset of the world economy, like China, for example, or a group of countries in Europe, or even a buyer's cartel like the world's airlines. That would be another possible sort of carbon bubble you could define to say, and we're going to require, and this group could require that anyone selling fossil fuels into that group has to ensure that a certain fraction of the fossil fuels they sell, of the CO2 embedded in the fossil fuels they sell, is geologically sequestered, permanently disposed of. Now, we know where we want to get to. We want to get to 100% storage by 2050. So it's very easy to work out what you need to do on the way. We need to be at roughly 10% by 2030, 50% by 2040, 100% by 2050. That would be a fair, smooth transition to 100% storage. So again, it's a very simple requirement. Get rid of 10% of the carbon dioxide generated by the fossil fuels you sell by 2030, and you're on a path to decarbonizing your fuels by 2050. Importantly, we allow, in this hypothetical policy, the fossil fuel provider to source their CO2 from any CO2 they can find that would otherwise have ended up in the atmosphere. That's important because it means you don't have to jump to the very expensive direct air capture technologies immediately. You can start off by deploying CO2 storage on point sources, which is significantly cheaper in the short term. So just to take you through how this works, the current situation is we have an extractor of fossil fuels selling carbon dioxide. The blue lines sort of represent embedded carbon to industrial point sources who make products, pass them on to consumers, and all the CO2 ends up in the atmosphere. So, you know, the industrial point sources, they're probably having ETS measures imposed on them. So they're not particularly happy, but you know, they're getting along. Consumers are happy. They haven't really noticed climate policy. The atmosphere is sweating. It's terrible for the atmosphere. The world is warming very fast. The geological storage operator is very sad because nobody is talking to them. They have no incentive to get rid of CO2. The government is asleep. It's not doing anything. And the fossil fuel extractor is just laughing. They're making ridiculous amounts of money at the moment, and they will continue to do so. And that, in fact, that was going to be my question for Matt, and maybe we can get back to this at the questions, is what does the fossil fuel industry do when it starts to face serious competition from renewables? Given the level of their rents at the moment, given the size of profits when you add up the profits and the royalties and so on in the fossil fuel industry, they've got a lot of firepower to fight back when the pressure from renewables really comes on. So what can we do to sort of correct this? Well, introduce a carbon takeback obligation. The government actually does something. It tells the extractor to pay the geological storage operator to start to bury CO2. And the first thing the geological storage operator is going to do is buy that CO2 from some industrial point source. And the pink lines here show some payments. So, you know, the industrial point source is maybe a little less unhappy because they're now getting paid for their CO2. So that's a good new income source for them. The consumers haven't noticed because it's only a small fraction of the CO2 that's required initially. So it's a very low cost. So they're still happily consuming away. The atmosphere is still sweating, I'm afraid. There's still a lot of CO2 going into the atmosphere because the policy's only just started. The geological storage operator, of course, is a lot happier because they now have some business. The government is getting serious. And the extractor importer is kind of annoyed because suddenly they have to do something that they didn't have to do before. But it's high time they stepped up to the plate and actually started to engage with helping solve the climate problem that their products have caused. So as we ramp up the storage obligation, this is sort of later on in the 2030s, 2040s, the amount we're storing goes up. We start to run out of storage available from point sources, and somebody has to set up some air capture to supplement that CO2 to ensure that there's enough CO2 going to the geological storage operator in order to deliver sort of 50% storage to the extractor so that they can keep extracting. Remember, this is a licensing requirement on the extractor that they have to show these certificates of CO2 storage if they're going to continue to bring fossil carbon into the economy. So there you are. The industrial point sources haven't changed very much. The atmosphere is starting to feel a bit better because the flow of CO2 into the atmosphere is slowing down. The geological storage operator by this time is doing really well because they've got a lot of business coming from all sorts of directions. The government's feeling pretty good, and the extractors may be starting to calm down a bit because, you know, at the end of the day, they're realizing they now have a long-term business model selling fossil carbon without destroying the planet. So finally, we get to 100% stored fraction. This is the scenario in 2050. You've got the same amount of CO2 going back underground as is coming out. It's being paid for by the extractors. Costs are being passed on, of course, but industrial point sources now have a new business, which they would have not had if they were just simply, threatened with an ETS type system. Consumers are happy because they're still consuming. The atmosphere is breathing a sigh of relief because global warming has stopped. And the geological storage operator remains very happy. The government feels completely awesome because it stopped climate change. And the extractor importer, from being the devil in the picture, now has a little halo over the head because they are the ones who've actually stopped the world from warming up. So that's the carbon takeback scenario. And just to point out to you the rather surprising economics of this, if you think about what this actually costs in terms of embedded costs passed on to the consumer, and let's assume all the costs are passed on and we don't actually see any costs being absorbed into the reduced profits or royalties of the fossil fuel industry, it's equivalent, you know, when you're only imposing a 1% sequestration requirement to a carbon price of less than around 50 cents a ton of CO2. So it's invisible. Of course, by the time you get to all 100% air capture costs, it's up at the cost of 100% air capture, sort of around $300 a ton or so, very possibly lower if people like Tim can drive the cost down to a fraction of that. But this is a sort of pessimistic estimate of air capture costs that we've used in our modeling. So what Stuart did in his paper, and what was really, we've been proposing this idea, Stuart Hazeldine and I, for a decade now, and made relatively little progress because people have always been concerned that it might drive up costs of fossil energy too quickly and have a negative impact on competitiveness or the economy. So in this paper, we really wanted to address this straight on. We modeled the implications of a carbon takeback obligation in an integrated assessment model. And we found, first of all, a very interesting result, which is that if you just impose the carbon takeback obligation, if that's your total climate policy, it has a strange problem, an unusual problem for a climate policy, which gets you to net zero by 2050, which this one does, is it's too cheap. Because initially, you're only sequestering a fraction of the carbon dioxide generated by your continued use of fossil fuels. This means that people don't reduce consumption of fossil fuels. They carry on generating CO2, and then you're left with a very big bill to drive, to sequester all the remaining carbon in order to get to net zero by 2050. So we can correct that by introducing, instead of $1,000 a ton carbon prices in 2050, we can introduce $100 a ton carbon price. So just enough to nudge down demand in the short term, and that gets us onto a 1.5 degree consistent path. So the take home of all this is that if we introduced a carbon takeback obligation now, it would reduce the risk of deployment barriers, both economic and non-economic, preventing the scale up of carbon capture at the speed we need to scale it up to meet our climate goals and achieve net zero by mid-century. It is a regulatory measure. It's very different, and it's an upstream regulatory measure. So it's a very simple measure to implement on the fossil fuel industry, which is already a very highly regulated industry. And if it was implemented alongside conventional demand side mitigation measures, it would allow us to meet the Paris climate goals at no significant additional cost, complementing all the work on renewables and fossil fuel deployment that Matt was talking about. So we need both sides of this story to meet our goal. Thank you.
Our final speaker, we're very privileged to have Professor Zheng with us today. He's a professor and executive VP of the Institute of Climate Change at Tsinghua University. For everyone out there, Tsinghua University is the Oxford of China, and for our Cambridge colleagues out there, that means they're the best university in China. And we've got Professor Zheng, who is the president of the Global Alliance of Universities on Climate, to speak to us today on getting down into the deep dive of what this means for China, the carbon neutrality and the progress they're making. Thank you, Professor Li. Starting later than you want it to?
Yeah, it is to the end. I think it should be up.
Are we sharing the wrong screen, are we?
Yes, 或者 stop share， 然后
Not putting it up here is the problem.
I think it should be here.
然后按一下 new sharing， 然后重新选一遍。这个
我看哪个是我的啊？这是我的。I think this is mine.
Probably should do screen 2 instead, and then we'll put it up over there because the people here can't see it otherwise.
Yeah, the moment. Look.
Yeah, let me just stop that PowerPoint. Can I think I know what I'm doing? Stop that.
So maybe during the operates computer. Okay, it works now. It works now. Okay.
I need to share it.
Yeah. Share screen.
Okay.
So thank you, Matthew. So I come from Tsinghua University, and before I start, I would like to say my appreciations to our Oxford colleagues. Oxford is a member university of Global University Alliance of Global Alliance of Universities on Climate. So I play as a Secretary General of the alliance. So I appreciate Oxford contribute to this great event to the GOC activity. Secondly, as you have just heard, so I appreciate that our colleagues from Oxford paid a lot of attention to China energy system, not only the global one, but also Chinese energy system. So I appreciate your effort. So now I would like to share something, our study on the decarbonization pathways for China and its power sectors. So as you know that China has announced, so our President Xi has announced China will reach carbon peaking before 2030 and reach carbon neutrality before 2060. So that's a big effort. So that in my understanding, that needs radical transformation of the whole society, including energy system. And I did not prepare much about the whole energy system, but I would say that to conduct that transformation, energy system is the most critical. So China's energy system is now composes of 84% of fossil energy and about 15.8% of non-fossil energy. So to reach carbon neutrality, I think the share should be reversed. So we need to establish an energy system with 85%, more than 80% of consumption from non-fossil energy. So I think that's just our future. So to realize that future, electricity power sector is very important. And normally people think that power sector should go ahead to support the transformation of energy system. To support the energy system transition and also the societal one. So for this purpose, my group made a study to look forward up to the year 2050 to look at how can we conduct the transformation of the power sector. And so we developed our own model called LOM-LOG. So that's so this model use the superstructure modeling technique, and it is the optimization model to pursue the least cost for whole energy transformation by inserting different technologies, especially the renewables. Our two colleagues have mentioned. So and the characteristics of this model is that we are starting the long-term transition of the power sector, the technology transformations. However, we also while this evolution of the whole of the time, we considered the power balance for short term. So that means so we believe that this kind of approach can get more accurate estimation about the future technology demand. And so basically we are for this study, our planning horizon is from 2018 to 2050, and we considered most applied power technologies, so that 14 plus 1. I will mention that. So that means from the fossil energy to renewable to wind to solar, and also we consider CCS that can be retrofit. The coal power plant can be retrofit to with CCS. And as you know, China is a big country. It's very big. So if we treat China as a lumped node without considering the power transmission, then we think that the estimation may be not accurate. So we for this reason we divided China into 17. According to the structure of power grid, we divided China into 17 regions. That means each region can be connected with transmission lines. And so in this way, that means for one region, the power is needed can be not only produced by itself. If it's cheaper, it can be transmitted from other areas with plentiful renewable resources. So this is roughly the concept of the model. So as I mentioned that we divided the whole China into 17 regions, and we considered the existing power transmission lines, and also we considered, because we are talking about 30 years later, so we have considered all the planned transmission lines. And then after 2030, there's no plan. Then our model will optimize. Each two regions can be connected in our modeling. In our model, then the optimization will select which transmission lines could be built that can save the cost. And as I mentioned, that to be accurate, we can we divided 1 year into 4 seasons. That means resources are different. So in winter, winds are higher, and then for each season, we select a typical day that divided into 24 hours. So that means we use 96 time slots that simulates the whole year power balance diagonally, hour by hour, and then at the same time, the power demand increases along the year. So the optimization, the time horizon is 30 years. So we simulate the under the constraint of power supply balance. then to sum up the cost, sum up the cost for each technology in each region. Then we do optimization, find we do the optimization in a holistic way to find long-term planning plan. And then for technologies, we considered most existing power technologies like coal power, like natural gas power, hydropower, nuclear power, wind onshore, wind offshore, PV, concentrated and distributed, etc. We also considered the biomass power generation. And then for the fossil energy and for the biomass burning power plant, we considered the CCS retrofit. So that means for each time node, we make for each technology we made 4 choices: whether to build, newly built, that's one choice. The second is retrofit with CCS. The third is to decommission the existing capacity before design life. And then fourth is to decommission the facility when it is design life meet. So for each time node, we considered, for each technology, we consider 4 choices. And then the superstructure technical can accommodate simultaneously all the potential cost that can be used for optimization. And as I discussed with Matthew this morning, so we considered the technology efficiency improvement along with time horizon, also the cost change, and to make the modeling more practical. We also considered for coal power plant in the future, it may to help the renewable power operation. The coal power plant may run in off design load, so the efficiency loss are also considered in our modeling. And under storage is described in that that's under storage technologies are considered also in our modeling, but they are competing. So the major principle is that all the technologies in our model is competing each other, that to reach minimum cost for the whole country. So our cost includes not only the operation cost for fuel, but also the investment for construction, and the investment for transmission. And therefore, also we consider the cost for CCS capture, but we did not consider the transportation cost. So this made the model quite powerful. So we can see that we can describe along in 30 years time horizon to meet the local power demand with different technologies. So that means it is a mixture of technologies. And we can also describe how to transmit power along regions. And we can also check whether the existing power transmission is effective or not. And we can check, because we have diagonal modeling, so we can check the power balance hour by hour. And for policy making, we can check for a 30 years horizon how the CO2 emissions behavior of each region. That will help to give a better policy. So this ends my methodology introduction. Then by using our model, we started for the power sector evolution for up to the year 2030. We considered 4 scenarios. The first one is business as usual. That means before this time point, China has our previous NDC. So along that speed, for renewable under development. So that we call it business as usual. Then the second scenario is enhanced NDC scenario. That means to increase our target for 2030 from 20% for non-fossil energy to 25%, and then keep this speed after 2030. Then the third scenario is a two-degree scenario. That means we need to meet the Paris Agreement 2-degree target, and the fourth is 1.5. So I think I need to. So I think now I introduce some result. So our finding is that according to the previous speed for non-fossil energy development, and also for increased for enhanced target, and keep that after 2030. Both policy scenario, business BAU scenario, and the enhanced scenario cannot meet the 2-degree target. It is here. This means that after speeding up before 2030, we should further accelerate the development of renewables to meet the 2-degree target. And then for the 2-degree target, we have different choices. That means late response, medium response, and immediate response. So you will see that you can look at the carbon emission trajectory. So to act immediately, you can have a more relaxed pathway. But if we act late, that means to increase. We act late, then the trajectory will be very abrupt. So that means a lot of fossil energy power plant will be decommissioned earlier. That could cause some problem with this unstable problem with society. And then for 1.5-degree target, that will be very difficult. Very difficult. That's very abrupt. Later I will show the result. So to reach the trajectories I have just mentioned, business as usual, enhanced, and 2-degree and 1.5-degree. So here just give some impression about the technology mix for the future. So roughly speaking, it is the installed capacity for the first two scenario and the third and the fourth are approximately 4,500 gigawatt, 5,500 gigawatt, and 6,500 gigawatt. That means 2.5 times, 3 times more installed capacity than it is right now. And if you look at the contents, so although the carbon emission trajectories are quite different, as I have showed, but for all the scenarios, non-fossil energy will be dominant. So the difference for remain fossil energy varies a little bit, not very little. The absolute amount are not small, are not large, but the carbon emission trajectory will be quite totally different. And I would say that BECS, BCCS, and the CCS is adjuster. So with more carbon capture, as you mentioned, then you can leave a little bit more fossil energy. But if you don't take this technology, then if you want to meet 2-degree target or even carbon neutrality target by 20 for 1.5-degree scenario, then you need only non-fossil energy. So that's the difference. And for the power generation amount, you will see that more than 90% power should be generated from non-fossil energy, and among them, about 55 to 60% power will be from intermittent renewable, wind and solar. So to stabilize the power grid is a big target. That means we need a lot of I will say that. So here, just some comparison. Compared to the business as usual for 2 degree scenario and the 1.5 degree target. So we need to develop more non-fossil energy, especially wind and solar. At the same time, we also need to apply CCS. And the long distance, long distance transmission requirement also increases when we have a higher target for carbon control, and CCS is certainly needed to minimize the cost. So our estimation is that it is run by 2050. The requirement for CCS could be between 600 million to 1,000 million tons per year. So that's quite big. But because China's power fleet is still dominated by coal power, so its average age is around 12 years old. So the stranded asset, the value, the loss for stranded asset is a big thing. You can see that for different scenarios. So more coal power should be decommissioned. So the higher the carbon target, then the more the stranded asset. So we have to deal with that carefully. And you can see that for 1.5 degree scenario, the cost, the stranded assets loss is big. But for 2 degree scenario, if we act earlier, then the loss could be reduced. And we also need a lot of investment. So in the morning you talked about the cost. So maybe in the long term, the power price could be reduced, but in between, in the process, because investment, you need a lot of investment. So we expect that the power price could increase for some time. So roughly speaking, so compared to the current level of investment, to decarbonize the power sector, we need to increase our investment from 1.3 to 1.9 times per year, lasting for 30 years. So that's quite big. So we estimate for whole energy transition, China needs to invest about 100 to 140 trillion yuan for whole energy system transition. And among them, about half are for power sector. And this is roughly what I have finished. So the last technology is about, we are thinking how to improve the behavior of coal power. So one solution is co-firing with coal with biomass that do carbon capture. That can help to improve the carbon performance of coal power very much. So this is roughly what I said. And for the time limit, I don't talk that much. I think finally, the policy recommendation, the more, I think you can imagine that. So firmly develop renewable energy. I think that's the right way. At the same time, pay to do technology innovation for CCS, energy storage, high voltage transmission. And then finally, we should also to ensure investment. Without investment, without green finance, I think the transmission it cannot be realized. So this is roughly what I report to the audience. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Lee. We've got time for one question. Is there any questions on the chat or any questions in the room? Myles, Professor Lee, would you be able to answer a question from
Myles? Thank you. Am I audible? All right. Yeah, I am audible. I just wanted to ask, thank you very much for that, Professor Lee. That was really interesting to hear. How does your model is a power sector model? Have you plans to extend? I mean, I'm thinking about the industrial emissions and other emissions that will also need to be part of this decarbonization pathway. Is your model integrated in with other models that would allow you to model the full emission pathways, or how is that done in China? Or
it works. Okay. So you know, my organization organized overall high strategy study for China, including from economic development, from urbanization, from industry sectors, from agriculture, as all greenhouse related sectors. So we organize a team to work separately, and then we do integration exercises. So in this sense, so the power model is one of the bottom models.
Yeah.
So in this sense, we didn't have an integrated model yet. All the people use their own model, and then we do a lot of work to integrate them together to form a whole picture for China that help the strategy making. But at the same time, in my group, we are doing two things. One is we are quite mature with this power sector. We developed that for a long time. And at the same time, we also developed some system model, including all the power, all the energy supply system, plus the consumer sectors. But I didn't show that.
Yeah, that'll be very interesting, because I think a lot of as we really grind down emissions, a lot of the interesting interactions will become between, say, heavy industry and the power sector. I'm thinking about, you were talking about load balancing, you know, to what extent will you be able to use big industrial consumers to manage the load? And so that's interesting. It's good to hear you're working on those fully integrated
we are
models.
working on that. That's exactly our target. So my team is working on the 2060 carbon neutrality pathways. So
yes.
we use more we use more modeling work, and at the same time, I'm lucky to meet you too. Yeah, so I would like to keep contact, and maybe we can have more communications and even collaborations.
Absolutely. Well, one thing, as Matt
Great.
knows, one thing I'm very interested in is actually modeling. If you actually had a carbon takeback obligation, just hypothetically, what would actually happen in a big?
Sorry, what's the question?
If you actually, I mean, it's just this is not a question, this is a proposal. Yeah. But it would, I think, be very interesting if we had an integrated model of both industry and power in China. What would happen if you imposed a carbon takeback obligation on that? How would it map through? What would happen to prices? What we did in our study was a very idealized model of the whole world. But in the end, policies don't get implemented on the whole world. They get implemented in countries, in jurisdictions. And so it would be just as an academic exercise, it would be very interesting to explore that. And I hope you can consider this, and maybe find a smart graduate student who might like to come and visit us in Oxford to pursue that.
Okay, that's great. That's a deal. But roughly, I can try to answer your question. So I think for China, so our commitment is quite clear. So we will peak our energy-related carbon emission, carbon dioxide emission before 2030.
Yes.
So it is not by 2030, it's before.
Yeah.
And so now we have a very sound, concrete policies to support such kind of target. We have a target.
Yes.
We have set up a strategy under our target. By 20, I think if you look at our new document, you can see that the document name, like the working guidance, have set up 3 time nodes: 2025, 2030, 2060.
Yeah.
So we set up 5 indicators for each time node. So that's target very clear. And then we have policies, action plans for each industry sector and cross section issues.
Yeah.
So this document are the action plans that support to realize this time target. So I would say that China has a very sound plan, and the whole society has been equipped with the mood to be able to go that way firmly.
And dare I say it, perhaps much better equipped than other societies for this transition that we face. We're reaching 10:30, so we have to vacate the room, I think, at this point.
Yes,
Thanks
give a
very much,
chance to
Matt. Thanks
the
for
other-
organizing.
the team to have their talk.
you.
Thank you both, Professor Myles Allen, Professor Li Zheng, for your expert advice today and for your time. And thank you for everyone for joining us here today.